The great hall of the Galactic Council buzzed with familiar tension. Dozens of alien species sat in their curved seats, their strange forms creating shadows under the bright lights. At the center of it all stood Ambassador Sarah Chen, the human representative. Her dark hair was pulled back neatly, and her face showed no emotion as she listened to the charges being read against her people. "The humans have violated Protocol 7 Alpha again," announced the Zelani delegate. The crystal-like being's voice rang like wind chimes through the chamber. "They gave advanced medical equipment to the Corvan colonies without asking our permission first." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the assembly. The Thakari representative, a creature that looked like a giant octopus with silver skin, waved its tentacles in annoyance. "And their rescue ships keep ignoring our territorial boundaries. They respond to distress calls from areas that are off-limits." Sarah had heard all this before. For 3 years running, humanity had been brought before the Council for the same basic crime, caring too much. They saved lives too quickly, shared technology too freely, and helped people the Council thought should be left alone. The Altarian Council leader, Zephyros, was a tall being with blue skin and 4 arms. He looked down at Sarah from his high seat. "The Council has grown tired of human interference in galactic affairs. Your species acts without thinking about the bigger picture." Sarah almost smiled at that. The bigger picture. She had seen that picture many times. It usually involved letting people die while the Council debated for months about whether helping them was politically correct. "Do you have anything to say in your defense?" Zephyros asked. For years, Sarah had given passionate speeches about human values. She had talked about the duty to help others, about how technology should serve all people, not just the powerful. She had pleaded with them to understand that when someone was dying, politics didn't matter. It never worked. The Council always voted the same way. They would scold humanity, add new restrictions, and pat themselves on the back for maintaining order. But today felt different. Sarah looked around the chamber at all the alien faces staring at her. Some looked annoyed, others bored. None looked like they cared about the lives that hung in the balance of their decisions. "The human delegation accepts the Council's position," Sarah said quietly. "We will follow your wishes completely." The chamber fell silent. This was not what they expected. Usually, Sarah would argue for hours. She would bring up specific cases, show them videos of people they had saved, explain why their rules were wrong. Zephyros blinked his large eyes in surprise. "You accept our ruling?" "Yes," Sarah replied. "Humanity will comply with all Council directives. We understand that our help is not wanted." The vote that followed was quick and unanimous. Another formal warning for humanity. Another set of restrictions on their activities. Another victory for bureaucracy over compassion. As the session ended, the delegates began filing out, chatting among themselves about other business. Sarah gathered her papers slowly, giving her aide Marcus a small nod. He understood immediately and began typing on his communication device. "That was easier than expected," said Councillor Vex, a reptilian being from the Draknari Empire. "Perhaps the humans are finally learning their place." Sarah heard the comment but said nothing. She finished packing her materials and walked toward the exit. As she passed the Corvan delegate, the insect-like being clicked softly. "Ambassador Chen," the Corvan said in a whisper. "My people's children are still dying from the plague. The medicine you gave us is running out." Sarah stopped and looked at the alien. The Corvan's compound eyes showed real fear. "I'm sorry," she said. "The Council has spoken. We are no longer allowed to interfere." The Corvan's antennae drooped. "But surely there must be a way." "There is," Sarah replied. "Ask the Council for help. I'm sure they'll form a committee to study the problem." She walked away, leaving the Corvan delegate standing alone in the emptying chamber. Outside the Council building, Marcus caught up with her. "The message has been sent," he said quietly. "All human ships, stations, and colonies will receive it within the hour." Sarah nodded. Protocol Omega was something they had hoped never to use. It was a complete withdrawal plan, developed years ago when it became clear that the galaxy saw humans as more of a problem than a solution. "How long do we have?" she asked. 72 hours, Marcus replied. "Every human citizen will be off non-human worlds by then. Every aid station will be shut down. Every research project will be ended." Sarah looked up at the alien sky above the Council world. 3 purple suns cast strange shadows across the crystal towers of the city. Soon no human would walk these streets. No human ship would dock at these ports. No human voice would speak in the council chambers. Do you think they'll understand? Marcus asked. Sarah considered the question. The council saw humans as meddlers who disrupted their careful balance of power. They never seemed to notice that their balance often meant people suffered while politicians argued. They'll understand, Sarah said finally. When the medical stations shut down and people start dying again, when the rescue ships stop coming and disasters become tragedies, when the research stops and their problems go unsolved, they'll understand exactly what they've lost. As they walked toward their transport, Sarah's communicator buzzed with incoming messages. Reports were already coming in from across the galaxy. Human personnel were receiving their orders and beginning to pack. Some were confused, others were angry, but all were loyal to the decision that had been made. Dr. Elizabeth Torres on Kepler Station was finishing her last surgery. The patient, a young Vrylan warrior, would live if the local doctors could maintain the complex life support system she had built. She was leaving detailed instructions, but she knew they probably wouldn't be enough. Captain Rodriguez of the cargo ship New Hope was redirecting his vessel away from the Xerion mining colonies. They had been expecting a delivery of atmospheric processors that would keep their air breathable for another year. Now they would have to find another solution. Engineer Park was shutting down the quantum communication relay that connected 12 different worlds. The system was too complex for any other species to maintain. When it failed, those worlds would be cut off from each other. All across the galaxy, humans were quietly closing down the infrastructure that held civilization together, not out of spite or anger, but because they had been told their help wasn't wanted. Back on Earth, the news of the Council's latest ruling was spreading quickly. Protests began forming outside government buildings. Citizens demanded to know why their people were being forced to abandon those who needed help. President Martinez addressed the nation that evening. For 3 centuries, she said, humanity has extended its hand to the stars. We have shared our knowledge, our medicine, our compassion with any who needed it. Today, the galaxy has made it clear that our hand is not wanted. She paused, looking directly into the camera. So we are bringing our people home. All of them. Let the Council govern their perfect galaxy without our interference. Let them solve their problems without our meddling. Let them face their crises without our help. The President's words were broadcast across human space. From the outer colonies to the inner worlds, the message was the same. Humanity was done being the galaxy's unpaid police force, medical service, and rescue team. In 72 hours, the withdrawal would be complete. The galaxy would finally have what it had always claimed to want, a universe without human interference. Soon they would learn the difference between what they wanted and what they needed. Across the galaxy, the evacuation began like clockwork. Human facilities that had operated for decades started shutting down with quiet efficiency. There were no dramatic speeches or angry protests. People simply packed their belongings and left. Dr. Marcus Webb stood in the trauma center of Kepler Station for the last time. Outside the medical bay, explosions lit up the darkness of space. The sector war had been raging for 2 years, and his team had saved thousands of lives from both sides of the conflict. He looked down at his final patient, a young Vrylan soldier whose chest had been crushed by falling debris. The alien's breathing was steady now, thanks to the artificial lung system Webb had installed. The blue-skinned being would live, assuming the local medical staff could keep the complex machinery running. "Dr. Webb," called Nurse Patterson from across the room. "The transport leaves in 20 minutes. Webb nodded and began recording his final medical log. Patient 77 Alpha is stable but requires constant monitoring of artificial respiratory system. The machine must be calibrated every 4 hours using the following procedure." He went on for 10 minutes, explaining every detail of the life-saving technology to people who might not understand half of it. Dr. Celix, the station's Vrylan chief medical officer, watched him work. Her large eyes showed confusion and worry. "Marcus, surely you don't have to leave. The medical bay needs you. We have wounded coming in every day." Webb finished his recording and handed her the data pad. The Council was very clear. Human interference is no longer welcome. Your people will have to manage without us. "But the hybrid medical systems," Celix protested. "The surgical techniques you developed, the pharmaceutical fabricators. We don't know how to maintain all of this." Webb felt a pain in his chest that had nothing to do with medicine. He had spent 5 years teaching these techniques to anyone who would learn. But the Council had made it clear that human knowledge was dangerous, that human methods were disruptive. "You'll figure it out," he said, though he knew it wasn't true. "You did before humans arrived." As he walked toward the transport bay, Webb passed the pediatric ward. Vrelon and Thakari children lay in beds, recovering from wounds that would have killed them before human medical advances. Some of them would probably be dead within a month when the equipment failed and couldn't be repaired. The transport ship Exodus was packed with humans from all over the station. Scientists, engineers, doctors, teachers, mechanics. They had been the invisible foundation that kept Kepler station running. Now they were ghosts, pretending their departure wouldn't matter. Captain Elena Rivera received the emergency transmission while her cargo ship Prosperity was 3 days out from Zarian Prime. The mining colony there was expecting a delivery of atmospheric processors that would keep their air breathable for another standard year. "Ma'am," her communications officer said, "we're getting a distress call from Zarian Prime. Their atmospheric systems are failing ahead of schedule." Rivera looked at the message on her screen. The colony administrator was begging for help. 2 million people lived on Zarian Prime, including many children. The planet's natural atmosphere was poisonous to most species, so the artificial systems were all that kept them alive. "Send them the standard response," Rivera ordered, her voice tight. "Captain?" The communications officer looked confused. "Send it," Rivera repeated. The young officer typed reluctantly. "Human vessels are no longer operating in this sector. Please contact your local authorities for assistance." Rivera watched the message disappear into space. Zarian Prime was too far from any council world for help to arrive in time. The colony's own engineers didn't understand the atmospheric processors well enough to fix them. In a few weeks, 2 million people would start dying, but the council had spoken. Human interference was unwelcome. On the research station orbiting Altair 7, Dr. Kim Chen was deleting 3 years of work. Her team had been developing a cure for Zalani crystal rot, a disease that was spreading through the crystal-based cities of the collective. They were only weeks away from a breakthrough. Dr. Chen, her Zalani research partner Harmony of Stars, asked, "Can we not continue this work? My people are suffering." Chen looked at the crystalline being who had become her friend over the years. Harmony's light was dimmer than usual, a sign of stress among her people. The council voted to limit human research activities. They said our methods were too aggressive, too unpredictable. "But the cure," Harmony pleaded. "So many will die without it." Chen deleted the last file. "Then maybe the council will fund Zalani researchers to continue the work. I'm sure they'll solve it eventually." She didn't mention that it had taken human creativity to make the breakthrough they were so close to achieving. The Zalani were brilliant, but they thought in straight lines. Humans thought in spirals, making connections that seemed impossible to other species. On cargo ships throughout the galaxy, human crews were changing course. Supply lines that had operated smoothly for decades were suddenly broken. The Thakari Trade Confederation sent increasingly desperate messages as their carefully planned logistics networks fell apart. Engineer Sarah Kim was aboard the maintenance vessel Fixer when the orders came through. She was halfway to the Draconian mining platform, where a critical failure in their gravity generators threatened to kill everyone aboard. "Change course to Earth immediately," her captain ordered. "Sir," Kim protested, "the Draconian platform will collapse without repairs. 50,000 workers will die." "The council doesn't want our interference," the captain replied. "Let them handle it themselves." Kim stared at her engineering displays. The Draconian platform used hybrid human-alien technology that no other species fully understood. The gravity generators were based on human quantum physics, integrated with Draconian power systems. When they failed, no one else would be able to fix them. The galaxy's communication networks began experiencing their first problems within hours. Human-designed quantum relays started developing faults that only human technicians knew how to repair. Translation protocols that allowed different species to understand each other began glitching. Research databases that had operated flawlessly for years started corrupting their data. On Earth, the returning ships brought news of the withdrawal's progress. President Martinez held daily briefings as the scope of the operation became clear. 17,000 medical personnel have been evacuated, reported General Santos. 400 research stations have been shut down. 800 cargo routes have been abandoned. 2,000 engineering teams have ended their contracts. The president listened to the numbers with growing sadness. Each statistic represented lives that would no longer be saved, problems that would no longer be solved, crises that would no longer be prevented. "Any word from the council?" she asked. "Nothing official," Santos replied. "But our intelligence suggests they think this is just a temporary scaling back of operations. They don't understand that we're leaving completely." President Martinez nodded. The council had never bothered to learn how deeply integrated humans had become in galactic civilization. They saw human actions as isolated incidents, not as part of a vast network of support that kept thousands of worlds functioning. In the Outer Rim territories, human colonies began receiving their evacuees. Ships arrived daily, carrying people who had spent their careers helping others. Many were angry, others were sad, but all were tired of being treated like criminals for showing compassion. The human colony on New Geneva became a temporary home for hundreds of doctors and nurses. They set up medical facilities for their own people, using the same advanced techniques they had been forbidden to share with aliens. "It feels wrong," Dr. Webb said to his colleague as they organized supplies. "We have the cure for a dozen diseases and we're just sitting here while people die." "The council made their choice," Dr. Martinez replied. "They wanted us to stop interfering, so we stopped." Webb looked out the window at the human ships in orbit. Each one carried refugees from the galaxy they had tried to help. "How long do you think it will take them to realize what they've lost?" "Not long," Martinez said grimly. "The first major crisis without human support will wake them up. The question is whether it will be too late by then." As the 72-hour deadline approached, the last human ships began departing alien space. They left behind empty buildings, silent machines, and growing problems that no one else knew how to solve. The galaxy was about to learn what life looked like without human interference. 3 weeks after the humans left, the first emergency session of the Galactic Council was called. The great chamber that had been so confident during humanity's trial now buzzed with nervous energy. Delegates whispered among themselves, sharing troubling reports from their home worlds. Council leader Zephyros called the session to order, his 4 blue arms raised for silence. "We are here to discuss recent developments following the human withdrawal," he announced. The Vrillon delegate was the first to speak. Ambassador Crick stood on shaking legs, his usual military bearing replaced by obvious distress. "The situation in our sector has become catastrophic," he began, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. "Explain," Zephyros ordered. Crix activated a holographic display that showed the Vrillon war zone. Red areas indicated active fighting, but what caught everyone's attention were the massive gray zones marked civilian casualty areas. "Without human medical support, our casualty rates have increased by 400%, Crix reported. The field hospitals that Dr. Webb and his teams operated could save soldiers and civilians who had lost limbs, suffered organ damage, or contracted battlefield diseases. Now those same injuries are death sentences." The hologram zoomed in on a refugee camp. "Vrillon Base 7 is housing 50,000 civilians. Before the withdrawal, human evacuation ships could move them to safety within hours. Now they are trapped in an active war zone because no one else has ships fast enough or protected enough to reach them." Murmurs of concern rippled through the chamber. The Thakari delegate waved his tentacles for attention. "My confederation is experiencing similar problems with our supply chains," Ambassador Kell announced. "The logistics algorithms developed by human traders allowed us to move goods efficiently between our worlds. Without them, our economy is collapsing." He showed his own holographic display. Shipping routes that had been smooth flowing lines now looked like tangled knots. "Cargo ships are arriving weeks late or not at all. Food shortages are developing on our outer worlds. Industrial planets can't get the raw materials they need." The Zolani representative, Crystal Song of Dawn, chimed in with her musical voice. "The research crisis is equally severe. My people have been working for decades with human scientists on projects that require both our logical thinking and their creative insights. Without human participation, most of our research has stopped completely." Council leader Zephyros listened to each report with growing unease. He had expected some minor inconveniences as the galaxy adjusted to operating without human interference. These reports suggested something much more serious. Surely these are temporary problems, he said, trying to project confidence. Our species survived for thousands of years before human contact. We simply need time to adapt. But privately, more reports were flooding into his office. The quantum communication network that connected the Council worlds was experiencing failures. Human-designed relay stations were going offline one by one, and no other species understood the hybrid technology well enough to repair them. The Altarian Deep Space Exploration program had been forced to cancel 3 missions because their navigation systems relied on human-developed algorithms. The proud Altarians, who had been exploring space for millennia, suddenly couldn't find their way to stars they had visited countless times. On Kepler station, Dr. Seelig stood in the medical bay where Dr. Webb had performed his last surgery. The young Vrillon soldier was dying. The artificial lung system that had saved his life was failing, and neither she nor her staff knew how to repair it. "Doctor," Nurse Tillich said urgently, "the calibration is off again. The oxygen levels are dropping." Seelig looked at the human-designed machine with desperation. She had watched Dr. Webb maintain it dozens of times, but the process involved quantum-level adjustments that required both human intuition and alien precision. Her people were logical and methodical, but they lacked the creative thinking needed to troubleshoot complex systems. "Try the backup protocols," she ordered, though she knew it was useless. The backup systems were simpler but less effective. The patient would survive for a few more days at most. As she worked frantically to save one life, Seelig could hear the sounds of chaos from other parts of the medical bay. 3 more patients were in critical condition, all dependent on human-designed life support systems that were slowly failing. On Zerion Prime, Colony Administrator Voss stared at the atmospheric readings with growing horror. The oxygen levels were dropping faster than predicted. The atmospheric processors that maintained breathable air for 2 million colonists were failing at an accelerated rate. "How long do we have?" he asked his chief engineer. Engineer Thrall consulted his instruments nervously. "At this rate, maybe 6 weeks before the air becomes unbreathable. Less if we can't fix the main recycling plant." Voss had sent 17 different emergency requests to nearby Council worlds, begging for help. The responses were all the same. They would send a technical team to evaluate the situation. The earliest any help could arrive was 3 months away. "What about emergency evacuation?" Voss asked. Thrall's face darkened. The human evacuation protocols could have moved everyone to safety in a week. Council evacuation ships are too small and too slow. It would take years to move everyone, assuming we had somewhere to put them. The administrator looked out his office window at the bustling colony below. Children played in the artificial parks while their parents worked in the mines and factories. None of them knew they were slowly suffocating. Meanwhile, reports of other crises were reaching the Council daily. The Corvin medical emergency was worsening as the last of the human-supplied medicines ran out. The genetic plague that had been contained was spreading again, and Corvin biochemists couldn't reproduce the complex human pharmaceuticals fast enough. Pirate activity had increased by 300% in the outer systems. The pirates knew that human rapid response ships were no longer patrolling the trade routes. Merchant vessels that had traveled safely for years were now easy targets. The draconian mining platform had indeed collapsed when its gravity generators failed. 50,000 workers died in the disaster, crushed when the artificial gravity that held their station together suddenly disappeared. The investigation revealed that the hybrid human draconian technology had a built-in safety flaw that only human engineers knew how to prevent. On the research station orbiting Altair 7, the Zilani crystal rot continued to spread. Without Dr. Chen's research team, progress on a cure had stopped completely. The Zilani researchers could follow the procedures the humans had established, but they couldn't make the intuitive leaps needed for breakthrough discoveries. Harmony of Stars visited the empty human laboratories daily, her crystalline form dimming with depression. "They were so close to finding the cure," she told her supervisor. "The final tests were scheduled for this week. Can we not continue their work?" her supervisor asked. Harmony touched the silent computer terminals where human scientists had worked. "They thought in patterns we cannot follow. They made connections between ideas that seemed unrelated. We can copy their methods, but we cannot recreate their inspiration." As the 4th week approached, emergency meetings were being held on dozens of worlds. The problems were not isolated incidents but part of a pattern that was becoming impossible to ignore. The human withdrawal had exposed how deeply integrated human knowledge, human compassion, and human problem-solving had become in galactic civilization. It wasn't just that they had been helpful. They had become essential. Council leader Zephyros sat alone in his office, reading report after report of failures, disasters, and deaths. His aide entered with another batch of emergency communications. "Sir," the aide said nervously, "the Zarian Prime situation is deteriorating. They're requesting permission to evacuate to Council worlds." Zephyros looked up tiredly. "How many refugees would that be?" 2 million, sir, and the transport logistics alone would require—" The aide paused, checking his calculations. "It would require the kind of coordination that human logistics teams used to handle." For the first time since the human withdrawal began, Zephyros felt a cold fear settle in his stomach. They hadn't just lost human interference. They had lost human competence, human innovation, and human caring. And across the galaxy, more people were discovering just how much those things had mattered. By the second month, the crisis had grown beyond anyone's worst fears. What had started as isolated problems had become a galaxy-wide collapse. The council chambers now met in permanent emergency session, with delegates arriving daily, bearing news of fresh disasters. The Thakari Trade Confederation was the first major power to formally request human assistance. Ambassador Kell stood before the council, his silver tentacles trembling with exhaustion. His confederation, which had controlled commerce across 12 sectors for centuries, was falling apart. "Our trade networks have completely collapsed," he announced. The logistics algorithms that human traders developed weren't just helpful. They were the foundation of our entire economy. Without them, we can't track shipments, coordinate deliveries, or even calculate profitable routes. He activated a holographic display showing the Confederation's trade routes. Where once there had been orderly streams of cargo flowing between worlds, now there was chaos. Ships wandered aimlessly through space, their captains unable to navigate the complex web of supply and demand that had operated smoothly for decades. Food shipments meant for the outer colonies are arriving at industrial worlds that don't need them, Kell continued. Raw materials needed for manufacturing are sitting in warehouses while factories shut down. Our people are beginning to starve while warehouses full of food sit empty on the wrong planets. The situation was worse than mere inefficiency. Pirates had noticed the confusion and were attacking cargo ships that were traveling alone, without the coordinated protection that human security algorithms had provided. Shipping lanes that had been safe for generations had become hunting grounds for raiders. Council leader Zephyros tried to maintain order as more reports flooded in. The Zalani Collective was experiencing technological collapse on a scale that defied belief. Their crystal-based civilization depended on quantum computing networks that human scientists had helped design. When those networks began failing, entire city-states went dark. Crystal Song of Dawn's voice was barely a whisper as she delivered her report. 17 cities have lost power completely. The hybrid crystal quantum computers that control our infrastructure require constant adjustment using human mathematical models. Without human technicians, the systems are failing faster than we can repair them. The Zalani had tried to maintain the systems themselves, but their logical, structured thinking couldn't handle the intuitive adjustments that kept the hybrid technology stable. Human engineers had worked by feel as much as by calculation, making thousands of tiny corrections that kept the complex systems running smoothly. "How many people are affected?" Zephyros asked. 40 million Zalani are without power, water, or communication, Crystal Song replied. The number grows daily as more cities fall offline. The academic crisis was equally devastating. Research projects that had been decades in the making ground to a halt across the galaxy. The Universal Translation Protocol, which allowed different species to communicate and share knowledge, was failing as the human-designed linguistic algorithms degraded without maintenance. Dr. Vesh of the Altarian Research Institute had been working with human linguists for 15 years on a project to decode the ancient texts of the lost civilization. They had been months away from a breakthrough that could have revealed revolutionary technologies. The translation matrices are becoming unreliable, Dr. Vesh reported to his supervisors. Human linguists didn't just program the computers, they trained them to think creatively about language. Without that creative input, the AI systems are losing their ability to understand context and meaning. The lost civilization texts, which had tantalized researchers for centuries, were becoming unreadable again as the translation systems failed. Knowledge that could have advanced galactic civilization by centuries was slipping away. On Kepler station, the medical crisis had reached a breaking point. Dr. Celix watched helplessly as patient after patient died from conditions that had been easily treatable just weeks before. The advanced medical equipment left behind by Dr. Webb's team was failing one piece at a time. "Doctor," Nurse Tillich said urgently, "the pharmaceutical fabricator is producing incorrect medications again. The chemical ratios are off." Celix looked at the complex machine that had saved thousands of lives over the years. The fabricator could produce medicines that were perfectly tailored to each patient's biology, but only if its quantum-level sensors were calibrated correctly. The process required understanding of both alien biology and human chemistry that no single species possessed. "Shut it down," she ordered. "We can't risk giving patients the wrong medication." As the fabricator powered down, Celix realized that dozens of critical medicines would no longer be available. Patients who could have been saved would now die, not from lack of knowledge, but from lack of the human intuition needed to operate the machines that contained that knowledge. The war in the Vreeland sector had escalated beyond all previous conflicts. Without human medical support, both sides had become more desperate and brutal. Wounded soldiers who would have been saved and returned to their families were dying on battlefields. Civilian populations caught in the fighting had no hope of evacuation. Ambassador Crix delivered increasingly desperate reports to the Council. The death toll has reached 2 million and climbing. Without human intervention, this war will not end until one side is completely destroyed. The humans had done more than provide medical care. They had also served as neutral mediators who could convince both sides to observe ceasefires for humanitarian purposes. Human doctors had treated wounded from all factions equally, creating trust that no other species could match. "Can your own medical services not fill the gap?" Zephyros asked. Crix's military bearing finally cracked. "Our doctors are skilled, but they think like soldiers. Human doctors thought like healers. They could convince enemy commanders to allow medical evacuations because everyone trusted that humans cared only about saving lives, not about politics." On Zerion Prime, the situation had become hopeless. Colony Administrator Voss stood in the Emergency Command Center, watching atmospheric readings that showed inevitable doom. The air recycling systems were failing faster than anyone had predicted. "Current estimates give us 12 days before oxygen levels become critical," Chief Engineer Thrall reported. 14 days before they become lethal. Voss had exhausted every option. Council rescue ships were still weeks away, and even when they arrived, they could only evacuate a few thousand people at a time. The complex atmospheric systems that kept 2 million people alive were beyond the repair capabilities of any species except humans. "What about rationing?" Voss asked desperately. "We're already rationing everything we can," Thrall replied. "The problem isn't consumption, it's production. The atmospheric processors use human-designed catalytic systems that we don't understand. When they fail completely. The colony had tried to contact Earth directly, begging for emergency assistance. The response had been polite but devastating. Human personnel are no longer authorized to operate in Council space. We wish you well in your future endeavors." Meanwhile, the ripple effects continued to spread. The breakdown of trade networks meant that many worlds couldn't get the resources they needed for basic survival. The failure of communication systems left entire sectors isolated from each other. The collapse of research projects meant that new solutions to old problems were no longer being developed. Even the Council itself was struggling to function. The complex voting and communication systems that managed galactic government relied heavily on human-designed coordination protocols. Without those systems, it took days to organize meetings that had once been arranged in hours. "We must face the truth," declared Ambassador Thresh of the Corvin Collective during one emergency session. "The humans were not interfering with our civilization. They were holding it together." The chamber erupted in angry protests from delegates who still refused to admit their mistake. But Thresh continued, his insect-like features fierce with conviction. "Look around this chamber," he demanded. "Half of our communication systems are failing. Our translation protocols are breaking down. We can barely organize a meeting, let alone govern a galaxy. And why? Because we drove away the people who made it all work. The Corvin delegates' words sparked heated debates that lasted for hours. Some species still insisted that the human withdrawal was temporary, that they could solve these problems given time. Others began to admit that they had made a terrible mistake. But while the council debated, people continued to die. Ships continued to disappear. Colonies continued to fail. And somewhere in human space, 2 million evacuated personnel watched the news reports with growing sadness. They had the knowledge, skills, and compassion needed to solve every crisis that was devastating the galaxy, but they were no longer welcome to help. The council had gotten exactly what they asked for: a galaxy without human interference. Now they were learning what that truly meant. 6 months after the human withdrawal, Council leader Zephyros stood before the largest emergency assembly in galactic history. Representatives from every known species packed the great chamber, many bearing the visible marks of their civilization's decline. Some delegates wore breathing masks because their atmospheric systems were failing. Others showed signs of malnutrition as trade networks continued to collapse. The chamber itself reflected the growing crisis. Half the lighting systems were flickering, because the maintenance protocols required human technical knowledge. The translation systems produced garbled speech that made communication difficult. Even the basic functions of government were breaking down. Zephyros looked out at the assembled delegates and saw fear in every alien face. The proud Altarians sat with dimmed auras, their deep space exploration programs completely shut down. The logical cerebroids twitched nervously as their AI systems continued to malfunction, without human creative input. Even the militaristic Kran looked defeated, their war fleets helpless against enemies who had learned to exploit the tactical weaknesses that human advisors had previously helped them avoid. "We are here," Zephyros began, his voice heavy with the weight of countless failures, "to face the truth about what we have lost." He activated the chamber's main display, showing a galaxy-wide status report. Red zones marked areas of complete systemic failure. Yellow zones indicated regions experiencing critical problems. Green zones, representing areas functioning normally, were terrifyingly rare. "The statistics are undeniable," Zephyros continued. "Galactic gross domestic product has fallen by 60%. Medical mortality rates have returned to pre-contact levels across all sectors. Scientific advancement has slowed to nearly zero. Transportation networks have collapsed. Communication systems are failing daily." The numbers were devastating, but they didn't capture the true scope of the tragedy. Behind each statistic were billions of individual stories of loss and suffering. The Vrelon delegate stood to speak. Ambassador Crix looked like a shadow of his former self, his military uniform hanging loose on his diminished frame. "The war in our sector has claimed 15 million lives," he announced. "Both civilian and military casualties have reached levels not seen in our recorded history." His voice broke as he continued. "We had become accustomed to conflicts where the wounded could be saved, where civilians could be evacuated, where neutral parties could negotiate ceasefires for humanitarian purposes. Without human intervention, war has returned to its most primitive and brutal form." The Xerion Prime tragedy had become a symbol of the crisis. Despite desperate evacuation efforts by the Council, only 300,000 of the colony's 2 million inhabitants had been rescued before the atmospheric systems failed completely. The remaining 1.7 million people had died slowly as their air became unbreathable. "Xerion Prime was preventable," declared Ambassador Voss, one of the few survivors. "Human atmospheric engineers could have repaired the systems in days. Instead, we watched our people suffocate while Council bureaucrats debated jurisdiction and protocols." The Zelani representative, Crystal Song of Dawn, spoke with a voice that barely registered above a whisper. Her crystalline form was noticeably dimmer than before, reflecting the failing power systems of her civilization. 63 cities of the collective have gone dark," she reported. 200 million of my people are living without power, water, or communication. Our quantum crystal hybrid networks require constant creative adjustment that only human technicians could provide. Without them, we are witnessing the collapse of a civilization that has existed for millennia. The academic catastrophe was equally profound. The Universal Translation Project, which had enabled unprecedented cooperation between species, had completely failed. Research consortiums that had operated for decades could no longer communicate effectively. The promising investigation into the lost civilization's technologies had been abandoned when the translation matrices became unreliable. Dr. Vesh of the Altarian Research Institute stood to address the assembly. "We have lost more than human assistance," he said. "We have lost the ability to think beyond our own species' limitations. Human researchers didn't just contribute knowledge, they contributed perspective that allowed us to see problems from new angles." The economic collapse was accelerating. The Thakari Trade Confederation had fragmented into dozens of smaller competing organizations as their centralized logistics systems failed. Supply chains that had operated smoothly for centuries now required constant manual coordination that was both inefficient and error-prone. "Our trade volume has dropped to 20% of pre-withdrawal levels," reported Ambassador Kell. "Entire star systems are experiencing shortages of basic necessities while other systems have surpluses they cannot distribute." The human logistics algorithms didn't just move goods, they coordinated the economic activity of thousands of worlds. But perhaps the most devastating report came from the Corvin medical delegation. The genetic plague that human doctors had contained was spreading again, but now it was mutating faster than Corvin researchers could develop treatments. Human medical researchers thought in ways that matched the creativity of the disease itself, explained Dr. Chicks, the Corvin chief medical officer. "They could anticipate mutations and develop preemptive treatments. Our own researchers are brilliant, but they think too logically. By the time we understand a new mutation, the disease has already evolved beyond our cure." The session continued for 3 days as species after species cataloged their losses. The proud Draconian Empire admitted that their mining operations had become unsafe without human safety protocols. The ancient ethereal collective confessed that their philosophical academies could no longer function without human mediators to bridge different ways of thinking. Even the Council's military forces were struggling. Pirate attacks had increased by 800% as raiders realized that human rapid response teams were no longer patrolling trade routes. Several sectors had become completely lawless as local security forces proved inadequate without human tactical support. On the 3rd day, Zephyros stood to deliver his final address to the assembly. The proud Altarian leader looked older than his considerable years as he spoke. "We called them interferers," he said, his voice echoing through the vast chamber. "We accused them of disrupting our careful balance of power. We saw their compassion as weakness, their innovation as chaos, their willingness to help as presumptuous meddling." He paused, looking around at the assembled delegates. "We were wrong about everything. The humans were not disrupting our civilization, they were enabling it. They were not interfering with our development, they were accelerating it. They were not imposing their values. They were demonstrating what our values could accomplish when combined with their capabilities." The chamber fell silent as Zephyros continued. "We have learned the difference between independence and isolation, between sovereignty and self-destruction. We demanded that the humans stop interfering in our affairs, and they gave us exactly what we asked for. Now we must live with the consequences of our own short-sightedness." The vote that followed was the first unanimous decision in Council history. Every species, every faction, every delegate agreed to formally petition humanity for assistance. Not as equals who deserved help, but as clients who needed the services they had foolishly rejected. The delegation that traveled to Earth was the largest in galactic history. Ships from dozens of species formed a convoy that stretched across several star systems. They carried formal apologies, offers of tribute, and desperate pleas for assistance. But when they reached Earth's orbital stations, they encountered something that chilled them more than outright hostility: polite indifference. The human officials who met them were courteous and professional. They listened to the delegation's requests with patient attention. They accepted the formal apologies with gracious dignity. Then they delivered their response. "The human government appreciates your petition," announced Secretary of Galactic Affairs Harrison. "Your request for renewed cooperation will be taken under consideration by the appropriate committees. We will contact you when a decision has been reached." Ambassador Cricks, speaking for the delegation, pressed for more specific information. "Can you give us any timeline for this decision?" "Our people are dying while we speak." Secretary Harrison's expression didn't change. "I understand your urgency. However, human policy regarding galactic intervention requires careful consideration. Given the Council's previous concerns about our activities, we want to ensure that any future cooperation meets with your full approval." The delegation spent 2 weeks in Earth orbit, requesting meetings, offering concessions, and begging for immediate assistance. They were treated with perfect diplomatic courtesy and complete emotional detachment. The humans had not become cruel or vengeful. They had simply learned to value themselves as much as they had once valued everyone else. The species that had once dropped everything to respond to strangers' emergencies now evaluated every request through the lens of their own interests and priorities. Dr. Webb, now serving as Earth's chief medical advisor, explained the change to his former colleague Dr. Salix during one of the few private meetings granted to the Eye.